So my name is Brooke Steinhauser. I'm the program director at the Emily Dickinson Museum. I want to thank you for tuning in. We wish we could be with you at Emily Dickinson's home this evening, but we are so thrilled that you're coming to us from all over the globe tonight. We hope that you will consider using the chat to let us know you're here. Share your words of affirmation and appreciation for these wonderful poets tonight. And you could start right now, if you like, by telling us where you're tuning in from. That's always fun to see. So we do have a few minutes at the end of the program for conversation with these poets, and you can feel free to participate in that too by adding questions as we go to the chat or to the Q&A feature that are both found at the bottom of your Zoom toolkit. So on one last note, we are enabling Zoom's auto transcription feature this evening, which generates closed captioning to the best of the computer's ability. And as this is computer generated, there will be some errors in the transcription along the way. So we hope you'll forgive us the errors. You can choose to use the transcription feature or not. If you want to turn it on or off, you can just go to the live transcript button at the bottom of your toolbar. And our program is going to last just about 1 hour. So we'll be together 1 hour tonight. Wow, Arizona has turned out in full force in the chat. I love it. And of course, one of our wonderful poets tonight is Poet Laureate of that state. We've got lots of Massachusetts folks. So great to see you. We have a Massachusetts poet here tonight. We've also got New Jersey. We've got folks from the Philippines. How fantastic is this? Oh, hello, France. Paris, France. Thank you so much again for being with us. It never gets old seeing you all chiming in the chat. So we have a real treat for you tonight. We're going to be hearing from two poets who share an interest in print culture, an interest in interpreting Dickinson and other 19th century women writers for our age. And we're going to hear them read poems tonight about transit, transitions, translations. So without further ado, it is my great pleasure to introduce tonight's featured poet. So first, we're going to hear from Rosemarie Dombrowski. Rosemarie is the inaugural Poet Laureate of Phoenix, Arizona, where she's coming to us from tonight. And she's the founder and director of Revisionary Arts, a nonprofit that facilitates therapeutic poetry workshops for vulnerable populations and the community at large. She's also the founding editor of both Rinky Dink Press, a publisher of micro collections of micro poetry, and The Revolution Relaunch, an award-winning creative resurgence of the official newspaper of the National Women's Suffrage Association. She's published 3 collections of poetry, The Book of Emergencies in 2014, The Philosophy of Unclean Things in 2017, and The Cleavage Plains of Southwest Minerals, a Love Story, which was the winner of the 2017 Split Rock Review Chapbook competition. Her poem Atypical was named a finalist for the Whitman Bicentennial Poetry Contest sponsored by Brooklyn Poets. And I'm going to have Rosemarie join our screen here. And let me also link you all to Rosemarie's website. Then we are going to hear from, I'm going to go ahead and add a pin for Resi. We're going to hear from the wonderful Resi Ibañez, is a Filipinx genderqueer poet and writer based in unceded Pawtucket and Pennacook land in Lowell, Massachusetts, where Ibañez also works as a public historian and community organizer. They have been previously published in Loom Press's Atlantic Currents, connecting Cork and Lowell and Loam magazine. They have pieces forthcoming from Blue Oak Press in They Rise Like a Wave, an anthology of Asian American women poets, and Maria's at Sampaguitas. They are the founder, organizer, and host of the monthly LGBTQ+ Lowell Open Mic, which is the first and only performance space devoted to LGBTQ+ artists in the city of Lowell, which is currently on hiatus because of COVID, and I have every faith that it will be returning with full strength, Resi. They have also performed with the Free Soil Arts Collective, a group devoted to creating space for artists of color in the Lowell area. Let me pop a website for Resi into the chat as well. There we go. So before we launch into tonight's reading, I would love for Rosemarie and Resi to have a chance to introduce themselves to you and to say hello to our wonderful audience and maybe tell us just a bit about yourselves in your own words and perhaps share anything that you want about current projects, current pieces of work.
Do you want me to start?
Sure.
Okay. I know I'm reading first, so I thought maybe I was supposed to introduce myself first. Hello, Emily Dickinson lovers and friends and poetry lovers from around the world. Thank you so much for attending tonight. I'm so grateful to be here. What an honor. So a little bit about me. I am the founder and director of Revisionary Arts, the nonprofit that provides therapeutic poetry workshops for vulnerable populations and the medical community and the community at large. And I'm also a disability and medical poet. I'm the mother of a 22-year-old son with nonverbal autism, intellectual disabilities, a seizure disorder, and congenital heart defects. So disability and illness are my territories. And accordingly, I became a poetic therapist out of necessity, because writing has been my primary means of survival, and I wanted to be able to gift that to others in need. But teaching is my greatest love, and long before I became the poet laureate, I was an educator and community programmer and curator of all sorts of creative journals and anthologies focused on the literary arts in Phoenix. And I also teach courses in women's literature, poetry, and the medical humanities at Arizona State University's downtown Phoenix campus. And maybe most relevant to tonight, I'm also obsessed with Dickinson. I'm something of a Dickinson scholar, and I'll get into the reasons for that later. Thank you.
Thank you, Rosemarie. Hey, Resi.
Hi. So hi, everybody, and thank you for, I just want to say thank you to so many people. Thank you to the Emily Dickinson Museum for inviting me to be part of this amazing series, and I'm so excited to hear Rosemarie's pieces and excited to be reading with you too. So thank you. And I want to thank everyone out there in viewership land who I can't see, but thank you all for joining in tonight to hear some amazing poetry. So I come from a family of storytellers. There's lots of ways to be a storyteller. So my mother, who immigrated from the Philippines, was an ESL teacher in the United States to fellow immigrants. And before she immigrated, she also taught English in a refugee camp to people from Cambodia and Laos and Vietnam. That's kind of her way. She did storytelling and brought stories into the universe. My father worked for many years in a print shop and was the person who literally kept the presses running. So that's how he did storytelling. My tatai, who is my grandfather on my mother's side, who I actually only know through stories, was a musician in the Philippines and was a composer and a songwriter. So I have that in my history. That's how I go about my work of poetry writing. And as Brooke said, I'm a public historian, so that's what I do for my day job, is also storytelling. But all the communities that I've been a part of, and moved throughout in this land of Turtle Island, aka North America, everyone makes an appearance in my poetry because that's just how I roll. I mean, that's just how it goes. I think the community feeds my stories that I tell, and I hope that I build community through my stories too. So I'm excited to share some of that with you all tonight. Thank you for having me.
Thank you both so much for being here. We're just thrilled to have you and so excited to hear you read your poems. So we'll go ahead and turn it right over to you, Rosemarie.
Okay, I'm going to get ready quickly. Thank you again, Brooke, and obviously the Dickinson Museum for including me in this series. It is such a joy and an honor to be reading virtually at the Dickinson House, which I have never visited in person, but someday I'm going to get there. So the poems that I'll be reading from tonight are from an unpublished manuscript entitled Emily's Advice to Girls in the New Millennium. It's a series of 40 prose poems based on what I call subjective translations or divinations of Emily Dickinson's fascicles, the 40 handbound books that she curated from 1858 to 1866. And part of the reason why I chose to translate entire fascicles, which contain about 8 to 10 poems each, as opposed to individual poems, is because I believe that Dickinson's work defies translation. I tell my students that I don't think it's important to crack the code of Dickinson, because to me, her poetry isn't about deciphering. It's about the act of subjective meaning making. And what I see and hear in Dickinson is advice to other women. hence Emily's advice to girls in the new millennium. I'm also obsessed with the fascicles in their entirety because they represent curatorial agency, which was so rare for a woman in the 19th century. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the first 3 editions of Dickinson's poems, which were horribly adulterated by editors. And so the fascicles represent both curatorial and editorial agency. And because Dickinson, as you know, was rejected by the literary marketplace during her lifetime, the fascicles also represent what I refer to as the beginnings of feminist zine culture. Z-I-N-E, zines being the DIY self-publishing endeavors taken up by women and marginalized peoples, most notably in the 1960s and the 1990s, and again today. So I really do consider Emily to be the mother of modern zine culture, at least poetically speaking. And I believe the fascicles represent Emily's subversion of the literary marketplace, which rejected her. And yes, I'm also a zinester, someone who makes zines. So this is a lineage that I feel intimately connected to. I've also mentioned that I'm a medical poet and medical humanities scholar. So this act of divining Dickinson with all of her ailments and medical conditions seemed almost inevitable. And Brooke and I recently spoke about Dickinson's years of caregiving for her mother after her mother's stroke. So I feel intimately connected to her in that regard as well, given that I identify as a full-time caregiver. Thank you for bearing with that long contextual introduction. And now I guess I'll read. Here are some of the poems from Emily's advice to girls in the new millennium. And just so you know, the titles of the poems represent the fascicles that they were derived from. And I'm going to begin with the 6th advice poem, and it's called Sixthly. Sixthly. You are always emerging from your cocoon, watching the levels of water in the creek, barefooted and breezy. Drink the wine that grows the seeds of the world. Remember that the answers can be found in the woods, that the return of the birds is a sacrament, that commerce won't stop when you die, that when you lose a friend in childhood, it will tear you apart as many times as you're able to sew yourself back up again. Because life is chaos and the world is synesthesia, and someday you won't be able to tell morning from night. Ninthly, reconsider the narrative that everyone has fed you since birth. Listen to the sounds of every space that you inhabit because one of them is trying to tell you something. Someday, you'll imagine your lover drowning, their eyes filled with brine. There are tempests of the sky and the body. Your heart is a church in which you harbor whatever secrets you want to believe about the afterlife. Don't be lured by the sounds of the tambourine man, because you have your own song to compose. 11thly, try not to take the dazzling things for granted, because some will pack up and leave town and others will be stolen in the night. Worse still, people may forget your name, call you a bird-like girl who's obsessed with circuses and the dead. You aren't the only one who doesn't approve of gender roles. You aren't the only one who's kept a secret, wrapped your brain in bandages so that no one could see how badly you wanted to scale the wall, have wild nights with your girl lover, read your slanted rhymes in the park. The faces in the crowd becoming a disapproving Jesus. 12thly, try to find something else to get high on. Maybe the angels of summer, a choir of birds in the woods. The wind is a metaphor for a man's hands. Your body like the curve of an urn, the wrapping of slender fingers. Don't use the word permission unless you really mean it. The act of a needle penetrating your flesh is the anguish of modern life, the misery of the memories that you can't bring back. Sometimes the order of the words doesn't make syntactical or linguistic sense, but there's a network of veins just under the surface of the page, chirping like crickets. And that's the language that you may not be able to translate. So you just have to feel something. 13thly, once you understand progress, you become a machine ravaging the belly of the earth, a pool of grief settling beneath the tree. Read the history of rebellion until you understand what they were fighting, until you're less afraid than you were before. Remember that the best crucifix is one that fits in your pocket like an invisible belief. When the voices keep taunting, remind yourself that you'll eventually get over it, become more eccentric, lie down and smell your body in a patch of dishonored grass. There's no such thing as magic, only a door to a room filled with birds, the sound of your humble heart beating until it stops and your soul's extinguished. I hope some of you can feel Dickinson in these poems. 17thly, eventually, the bees will stop pollinating and things will stop growing and you'll wish you were somewhere else. The act of baptizing yourself is the only one that counts. Someday, you might be unrecognizable and you'll keep turning round and round in the mirror, your homely feathers dripping everywhere until it starts to make sense again, until you begin to believe in the afterlife, because it's the only thing that gives you hope when you have no one to make love to. Remember that the only thing you can count on is the sharp smell of death, the flies buzzing around the table, landing on the rinds that you've tossed to the ground. 19thly, maybe you've always been a midnight girl in a daytime town. And maybe it's okay to love progress because of how quickly death takes it all away. And maybe it's okay to feel this way because of how hard it is for the brain to process. Like how pleasure can make the wilderness come alive in your head. The only truth you need to know is that aging is the art of dying. That nearly every woman has secretly wanted to die and be resurrected as a dancer. Someday, when we're no longer girls, the morning will stop wanting us, and there will be no more eternal summer. 28thly, there are a few things you need to be told. That you can grow a god in your head. That sometimes you're going to be the bird that stays too long, the one that gets trapped in the winter, but you'll eventually have to stop damning yourself. If you've never heard the parable of the dying tiger, the moral is this, that it's no one's fault because death is just a fact, like Jesus hanging like stalactites from the cross. You should always live in the moment because immortality is something that most of us can't afford. You don't really know what you're seeing when it disappears into the grass. But when you pray for something silly, you can be assured that no one's listening. 31stly, when you're burning in the night, your skin will blister and the river won't be able to reach you. Ask yourself if it's better to remember the sweetness, the time before you split apart and could see the sky from the inside. Clutch it with your eye, like the notes in the margins, that little slice of mind. How the rooms are filled with the gifts of the cosmos, things you can't ingest or possess. Remember that you're superior to nothing and no one. Remember that you can fill in the gaps, solder yourself at the seams, prepare to be tortured again. 38thly, when there's less than half a dozen of anything, there's really nothing to see. You can speculate all you want. Maybe they were short of breath or drowning in suffering. Maybe God's been laughing all along. But what's the point of having conviction if there's no formula for conjuring glee? Sometimes girls are more astute than experts, and you just have to keep mouthing the words until you believe them, until you can taste the suffering for yourself. It's easy to see why girls go back to God, because time heals nothing, and life is really just the monarchy of the birds. So the last two poems were divined from the unbound sheets, not the fascicles. So what some people call scraps, and their titles are a little different. Unbound Advice, 40 through 50. Not the days anchored by divinity, not the condemned lip or the fissure in the moon, the famine of vanity and the foreignness of your own face. Like an immigrant without a settlement, the hollows of your eyes like the house we can never inhabit together, the crisis behind the door, the habits we form out of curiosity, how we become pioneers of disaster, how we have accepted the chemical concoction of fate. To be impaled is to have a liturgy composed in your honor, like little gifts of meat hanging from the trees, the squirrels singing your name as they devour the bloody hearts. And this is the final piece, Unbound Advice, 51 through 75. Thank you again. Like a witch, she's carved a breathing woman out of corn, dropped your brain in the deepest water, her lips a scarlet buzz. The doors are closing and you can feel it, like the end of a June exhibition, like your mind italicized, the aloneness in the room like a single blade of grass, the way an idea is like a door without a caption, a wrinkled morning and a nameless bird, the bread you store for later, the decade flying by like a circus, the seeds destroyed, everything outgrowing itself as the girls sigh their stupid sighs and wave goodbye. Thank you.
That was awesome. So cool. And I can't wait to read the whole collection when it comes out. That
Thank
sounds
you.
amazing. Oh my gosh.
I hope University of Amherst will break their rules and publish a collection of poetry, or Amherst Press. That's what I'm hoping.
I will definitely be in
Thank you.
line to buy it at an independent
you.
bookstore, because that's how I roll, and that's how I hope everybody rolls.
Yes, changing hands in Phoenix. Yes.
That was
Thank
so
you.
cool. Thank you for
so
sharing
much.
that.
Thank you.
Wow.
Thank you. I'm so ready to relax and hear your poetry now. So please, thank you. It's
My
such an
face
honor
is
to be
sweating
here.
from nerves in my seat now. Okay.
It's so wonderful to share this space with you. You're
Oh.
such a joy. Thank you.
I'm so glad to be sharing the stage with you tonight too. And I'll say more before I get to my last piece of the night, because Well, I'll just say more. There's reasons.
Okay.
So hi, everybody. And thanks for joining. So I'm going to start with a piece that will help me just kind of break the ice on camera. So it's a little bit shorter. But this one is called Love Letter to My Hips. Hips. I love you. I love you when you move the earth, when you sway and smoothly sashay me from place to place, when you are my sixth sense, when you detect rhythm and tempo, when you lift my feet in time and drop the stomps in a weighted, syncopated 6-count salsa. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. When you accent the tempo on a dance floor, when you help me articulate music, translate sound to my body, hips, if music is a universal language, then you are a native speaker. When you are the center of my body universe, you give me gravity. You move the earth, the wind, the skies, the clouds. You are not afraid to move. You are not afraid to speak. You are not afraid to take up space. When I began to understand my gender identity, you reminded me that I am a butch who is not afraid to dance. Forget what everybody else says, because hips, you are my God-given right to speak rhythm. Hips, you are my God-given right to speak love. You are my God-given right to speak truth. I claim you as you move me to a place where gender does not matter, where music speaks loudest, and the only thing that matters is melody, tempo, bass, percussion, and gender euphoria is the stereo turned to 11, where we dance like no one is watching, because I don't care. Hips, I love you for not speaking gender. Speak music to me, speak curves, speak the language of bodies making their own music, the language of melody, tempo, bass, percussion. Speak curves like sound waves, crescendo and crash like cymbals on the ocean of skin, the ocean of dance floor. Dear hips, you taught me to never lie. And the truth is this: you say things my mouth never could, and I love you. So yeah, I love my hips, if you can't tell. But I wrote that in a way when I was starting to understand my own non-binary gender identity. And I feel like there's this subtle message, and I don't know if I'm inaccurate in all in saying this, but I feel like there's this subtle message in white queer culture that AFAB people who identify as non-binary or trans don't dance. And I was like, whoa, hold up. Okay, I am a person of color. You can't tell me not to dance. That's just not going to happen. We're going to keep dancing all night long. So that was my poem about my hips, and I hope you get to dance sometime tonight too. So hi, everybody. Thank you again for joining me. I have a few other pieces now that really talk about sort of the people and places in my life that my hips have taken me through, that have moved me and shook me in a way. So one of the pieces is an older piece of mine. I live in Massachusetts now. I'm originally from the northern New Jersey area, very close to New York. And so this piece is called Port Authority. If you ever travel to New York, if you ever take a bus, this is where you'll end up, is this place called Port Authority. Port Authority. There's something about that bus terminal. I wonder about those people there at Port Authority. You know the people I'm talking about, the ones who are always there. They have their tickets, they're ready to go. No, going. They're not waiting. Their feet are already out the door, but they're always there. I wonder where they are going, if they're going home. I wonder where home is, since they never leave this bus station. I wonder if those people are really all white, or if that is a mere accident, unintentional coincidence of the sculptor's material. You know the people I'm talking about, the commuters, always stationed in the ticket lobby for the buses bound for Jersey. Maybe they're like me, white plastered exterior, but cast in bronze, true colors underneath. There's sirens going on behind me, sorry. I also wonder how they are always moving, en route to someplace else, and yet standing still here, permanently passing through this door. And how many doors have I passed through here? There's something about that bus terminal, always on my own ways to get home, even though home is a moving target. Home is having each foot on opposite sides of a fault line. Home is always passing through revolving doors through this bus terminal. There's something about this bus terminal because I'm always here too. Something always brings me back here, always on my way to someplace else. Home is being in transit, sitting uneasily on a fault line, on borders between continents, on boundaries between binaries, the threshold, the border, the dividing line, crossed, crossing, pushing back against, out of this hard white plaster covering bronze casting, sculptor's mistake. Home is always crossing that threshold, being the first person in line. I was born to run, and not just through stations at rush hour either. These commuters are bound for New Jersey, and I was bound to leave. You ever think about how much time is spent running after your way out of someplace? I was born under Sagittarius, the sign of commuters and movers. So it was written in the stars, this Bruce Springsteen prophecy. Blood doesn't run in my veins, but my veins are the map of my body, my history, how my mother immigrated from the Philippines and I left New Jersey to continue that legacy, because lines and borders are something I feel very viscerally. Moving and border crossing all coded in me genetically to be always in transition, in between places, destinations. The commuters always in movement. They are the company I keep. They're not going anywhere, but they go everywhere with me. There's something about this bus terminal. So a little context about that piece. I talk about a piece called The Commuters, which it's kind of hard to, for you to kind of experience me reading this without seeing it in print. But The Commuters is an art piece. It's a statue in Port Authority, and how it is, it's 3 or 4 people who are cast in bronze, but they have this white plaster on the outside, and they're walking through this kind of fake door that's just hanging out in the middle of the floor, and it's just called The Commuters, and that's the statue there. So, and it's in the lobby for if you buy a ticket going to New Jersey. So that's what that was referencing there. The artist who did that statue, again, if you visit New York and you visit the Stonewall Inn in Greenwich Village, there's some statues across the street from it, also done by the same sculptor. I think his name is George Siegel, I think. So this next piece switches gears a little. It's about a place in outer space. It's called Jupiter. I wrote it for my wife, Heather. So Jupiter. One of my favorite stories about your childhood is how your dad would make you stand outside and identify 3 constellations every night. I've tried studying constellations on my own, but I can only pick out one, usually. You and I have stood outside together so many times, looking up for recognizable shapes. You help me see more tender stars. It must be so exhausting for them to shine their best, even as they are vulnerable, even as they are tired from sending their light and energy all over the universe, just so other beings millions of light years away can look up and feel at peace. How do they do that? How do you do that? Day after day, night after night, expending your precious energy on those around you, all the while fighting through dark clouds, asteroid belts, black holes. You give me proof that we are all made of stars. You are an amazing galaxy, and you help me see more. You help me see that I am one too. And together we can take on the universe. I told you once that I reach for words like stars. You give me stars to reach for. Every place you kiss me is another new bright star in my own galaxy. And we can take on the universe because we are creating it ourselves. It is a symphony. I've told you about the marching band show I did my senior year of high school. Gustav Holst's The Planets. The final movement was Jupiter, and we had points taken from our score because we used confetti. You and I are that movement. We are the defiant confetti on the ground, ignoring the naysayers, being sparkly as all hell that judges who don't know any better say we should be in. But they don't know the sounds stars make when they come into existence. They don't know how fabulous it all is, how there are prisms of colors that shine all night, how they carry sound waves emphatically, triumphantly across the universe, even through dark clouds, asteroid belts, black holes. We are all made of stars. Yours is a galaxy I never want to stop exploring. Ours is a universe I want to keep building, where stars shine bright as confetti and light years don't matter. Tender moments between us are as triumphant as the most melodic and vulnerable section of Jupiter's movement, which Holst called the bringer of jollity. We are so good at bringing that jollity to each other, but creating a universe with you happens in the quietest, most tender moments, and that sounds like some amazing kind of magic. It sounds like proof that we are all made of stars. You and I are some kind of unexplained phenomena. We are more magic than the Big Bang can explain. Together, we are creating something bigger, more fabulous, more amazing than this world has ever seen. We are creating a symphony more tenderly melodic, more triumphantly vulnerable than this world has ever heard. And that kind of magic deserves all the confetti in the air, all the confetti on the ground, all the stardust in our breath and our bodies. So that was a true story. I was a band geek in high school, and we did do the planets as our my senior year show. If you haven't listened to it, it's a really beautiful symphony, especially the Jupiter movement. You might have heard it before. It's a popular choral arrangement, but I definitely recommend listening to it if you just need music to zone out to and like listen to the universe. Gustav Holst, The Planets. It's beautiful. So this next poem is a newer piece. So this past, I guess, June, I did a workshop with poet Megan Falley, and it was all about form poetry and kind of working through different forms. And this form is called a pantoum, which is I feel very partial to as a form because it originates in Southeast Asia. And a pantoum has pairs of interlocking lines that kind of repeat from verse to verse. So this piece is called My Kitchen Rebuilds. My mother's prized possessions were vintage Corelle and Pyrex dishes, made in the land of Onondaga, the keepers of the Western Door. I found myself visiting the Corning Museum of Glass, home of vintage Corelle and Pyrex dishes. The production process patented, kept wrapped in protective tight secrets at the Corning Museum of Glass. My mother wanted to be here with me. The production process patented, kept wrapped in protective tight secrets, vintage patterns in exhibit cases under bright display lights. My mother wanted to be here with me to see patterns of American kitchen domesticity, vintage patterns in exhibit cases under bright display lights, the history of glass behind glass, transparent and secretive patterns of American kitsch, signs of having made it inside your own cabinets. The history of glass behind glass, transparent and secretive, just like her, a social butterfly who held so much within her chrysalis. The signs of having made it hidden in American dream cabinets, unbreakable plates made in the USA. A colorful vintage design brought out for social dinner parties who held a lot inside, 30 years in this country with stories I never knew. An unbreakable face in the USA. On Day of the Dead, I offer her an altar on a Bilao plate. I've been alive 30 years in this country without knowing all the contents of her vintage Pyrex soul. On Day of the Dead, I offer a Bilao used to separate rice from stones on mountainside terraces. The contents of her vintage Pyrex soul separate from myth and posthumous portrayals. I separate what feeds me from what grounds me and offer her tea in a Corelle teacup. I separate from myth and posthumous portrayals while her spirit sifts to the top of hot water to guide me. I brew tea in her favorite sun blossoms pattern teacup and welcome her home with star lanterns made of shell. Her spirit sifts through window screens to guide me. When she enters and plays the wind chimes, she knows she is home with lanterns from her land made of shells found on sand that can turn into glass. When she passes through glass and plays the wind chimes, sees the hand down vintage Corel and Pyrex in my cabinets, made from shells and sand that turn into glass. In my kitchen, she is home. The hand-me-down vintage Corel and Pyrex in my cabinets, her life's work and joy from scouring Salvation Army and Goodwill shelves, now in my kitchen. It is her rebuilding of the American dream, a complete collection of what you can achieve secondhand. Sourced and scrapped together from Salvation Army and Goodwill shelves, discounted plates, unbreakable joy, made in the USA, a complete collection of what you can achieve. Joy passed down from strangers, unbreakable me, made in the USA. Discounted plates, unbreakable me, made in the USA, were my mother's prized possessions. Inherited joy, unbreakable plates made in the land of the Onondaga keepers of the Western Door. So, do I have time for one more poem, Brooke? Okay, thanks. So this is what made me really excited to read with Rosemarie when I found out what you were reading. This poem I wrote as part of that workshop in July with Megan Falley. And it's kind of, this might be a weirder poem to hear than it is to read, but it's another form poem. It's an invented form called a haiku, invented by Filipino poet Eileen Tabios. And it's the haiku is a 3-line poem with 6 words. Each line is 1 word longer than the last line. So on the page, kind of looks like this. The title of this, which made me really excited, is called Lessons from Emily as Tropical Sunshine. Before you existed, I represented victory of people power, a triumph won with their hearts. In the land of the morning, you are the child of me. In the sky, I look as big and round as Bob Ross's hair. Everything I touch, I paint. The universe is my canvas. You are the signature that authenticates and gives it value. People think I am responsible for fading colors, washing out, but they forget the entire light spectrum beats in your heart. Remember when your family moved to the apartment in the yellow house? You wanted to live in the walk-in closet with windows and green carpet. I was the one who gave you the room with the tarnished yellow carpet instead. The color of darkened highlighters, a well-traveled yellow brick rug needing your magic footprints, dance steps, imagination. Your favorite color is turquoise because you were born in December, but the angel of December wears yellow. Don't deny the color of your soul. The same color as Nancy Drew's spine, finding the truth on your bookshelf. You picked the color morning glory blue for your walls. That color should have been named for me, the one who sees you when you rise, the one who found you in a Kmart when you needed clothes to play me in the 5th grade class play on the solar system. The only day of joy you had in Catholic school was when you got to be yourself and everything revolved around you. You, an introvert, shy, bullied into keeping quiet, reclusive, trained not to look direct at me, not to look direct at yourself. Your mother thanked God for the day that you let a certain slant of you out. When the universe of the auditorium listened, when you eased your strikes of lightning to the children around you. Reclusive eclipse, we align more often than not. At Mount Holyoke, your class color was me. Golden, storied, mysterious, like a sphinx. People think I only wear white, but black and white photos tell it slant. My heart beats the entire spectrum, remember? You wore off-white at your wedding that was made of yellow pineapple fibers. Your paper sunflowers were made of painted book pages. Nancy Drew found the truth in your hands when you held your wife's. Her name is Heather. Ask Bob Ross's palette who complements purple. Don't hide your gaze. See yourself like a summer solstice. Take your time and dazzle gradually. You are a superb surprise, and so am I. Like the smell of fried plantains on a Saturday morning, like the house I grew up in, like the setting sun that passed you by, or when you flew through one, traveling back in time, landing where I had not yet. Remember, you are from the land of the morning, child of the sun returning. Reclusive eclipse, the land listens to you. Shadows hold their breath when they see your palette. Don't paint your heart slant. Do you see me now? Thank you.
Oh my gosh, I'm just gonna go ahead and give a nice big round of applause from everybody here who I know is doing the same thing at home.
Yay. That was beautiful.
It was absolutely gorgeous. Thank you both so much. I love that you both blessed us tonight with your Dickinson poems. That last one, Resi, what a playful surprise there at the end from you. I don't think I had seen that one in your submission for our reading series, and I just love that you've ended on that note. And I think that leads me to what I want to be the first question of our now conversation time that we have together. So we have about 10 minutes. We'll see, how far we get with some of these questions. But if anyone out there has some questions that you'd like for us to pose to these wonderful poets tonight, please do feel free to pop them into the Q&A or the chat. I'll go ahead and kick us off. So Rosemarie, we heard your Emily's advice for girls in the new millennium. Resi, what was the title of that last poem? Was it Emily Dickinson as Sunshine? Oh, you're muted. Sorry.
Sorry. Lessons from Emily as Tropical Sunshine.
I love that.
That is great. I love it too.
I think you both in those poems did the most beautiful job of kind of spelling out some of Dickinson's immediate relevance for all of us today. Resi, I know you also certainly have spent a lot of time thinking about other 19th century women writers, for example, Lucy Larcom, who was a contemporary of Dickinson's, and Rosemarie, I know you teach a lot of other, you teach women's literature. So, you both have this sort of abiding intellectual interest, it seems, in the history of women writers. And I'd love to hear more from you about what lessons you think we can take from them, how that kind of plays into your own creative practice, but also if you might imagine, do you imagine poetry as a form that can either be used to resist patriarchal gender roles or even gender binaries? So I just threw a lot of questions at you. Feel free to respond. Feel free to respond to any of them.
I was trying to figure out which part of that to latch onto. I don't know. Resi, do you have a thought, or do you want me to go first?
Oh man.
I mean, I was just going to say, I feel like DIY endeavors always resist patriarchal constraints, rules, artifice. I think that, again, is why my love for Dickinson has resurged, because the fascicles have been released. And so, like, I feel as though my relationship with Dickinson is so much more intimate now that I'm seeing her the way she curated herself. Mm. And so I feel like, those translations represent that, this is how Dickinson's poetry evolved, not the ways in which it's been presented to us for, over 150 years. And so poetry, when it is curated by women and non-binary individuals, absolutely resists any kind of patriarchal adulteration. But, of course, the problem is, women die and people adulterate their poetry after the fact. So
yeah, no, absolutely. I'm just thinking about the context of where I am. I mean, I could answer with my historian brain. I have to put that back on because I've been poetry brain right now. But for sure. So if those of you watching don't know, where I live in Lowell was a very large center of the Industrial Revolution. And part of its history is that a lot of the early workers were women workers who took it upon themselves to organize and go on strike and work for better working conditions. They also produced their own literary sources as well too. So I think this is like the earliest literary magazine in United States was the Lowell Offering that was all run by women. So I actually found a copy in a thrift shop a while ago. Like this is printed in the 1840s, and it's all women authors. And there were two actual publications written by them. This is more of a literary one, the Lowell Offering, but they did have a union kind of newspaper as well, called The Voice of Industry, which if you were interested in reading is online at industrialrevolution.org, which I think is kind of hilarious that exists. But there's some interesting pieces there about social justice too, like broader causes of social justice that the Mill Girls were very connected to, women's suffrage and abolition, so among others. So that you can find that online. But yeah, absolutely, totally resisting patriarchal norms and articulating kind of this early proto-feminism in a way. So.
Yes. I mean, Resi, don't you think print culture in general, when it's generated by women, does that? Because I'm a scholar of suffrage journals as well. I'm obsessed with 19th century print culture. And it's been amazing to me to go into so many of the archives, held at various libraries around the country and see the productions of the suffrage movement. There's so much amazingly tangible evidence of these curated journals that contain news and poetry and personal narrative and first-person accounts. And it's a very different narrative than what, let's say, the master narrative has given us. Absolutely. And so, yeah, I mean, print culture is where it's at. Those are the artifacts of our past and the versions of our history that, have largely gone unwritten. Yeah, since the original writers wrote it.
And women, for sure, women and other kind of gendered beings is a phrase that I picked up from someone, which I really like.
That's good. I like that.
And also, I mean, I think putting words down in print is also a very important thing for people of color as well. If we think about the 19th century, right, like, a lot of Indigenous tradition is oral storytelling, right? So there are some written down, not a lot, but there are some, and for African Americans, like it was completely illegal for them to be literate at all.
I know. Right? You were making me think of the abolitionist papers, which, I study alongside suffrage journals. I mean, if it weren't for Frederick Douglass's two papers, would we really have an accurate history of what life was like for African Americans in the 19th century, whether free or slaves, if we didn't have the narratives? No, we wouldn't. So I think print culture is everything. It's our truth.
There's an organization in Lowell, which I think the bio you had of me, Brooke, is maybe older because I hadn't added this to it yet. But during the pandemic, I started volunteering. Lowell has also a very large Cambodian population, one of the largest in the United States. And again, kind of similar, like their storytelling tradition is very much oral. So it's hard to get it captured down in print, but there's an organization called the Cambodian American Literary Arts Association, or CALA for short. And they're trying to do that work of getting the voices of Cambodian writers out there and Cambodian stories and histories out there for people to experience, and also for that storytelling to keep going. So.
Thank you. I really think I could listen to you to have a conversation about print culture and literary history all night. I think I want to just give you one last question, which you've led me beautifully into, which is, so you've both been talking about some of your experiences in community work. Resi, you founded the first and only performance space devoted to LGBTQ artists in the city of Lowell. Rosemarie, you founded a nonprofit that provides therapeutic poetry workshops for vulnerable populations. You're both talking, right now about these wonderful traditions. I'm wondering if you can both describe your vision, your dream for a more radically inclusive future of poetry.
I consider I consider poetry to be a gateway to mental stability is what I consider it to be. I think the term mental health is very relative. I think mental wellness is very relative. I think we all carry so much suffering and so much trauma with us, whether that's generational, familial, however it's generated is moot. And I think one of the most profoundly beautiful ways I have found to share that and to what I like to call burn off some of the top layers of it, to purge a little bit of it, is to use the page. And then to not hoard the page, but to share the page. So for me, the inclusive community involves not just getting people to see poetry as a portal for understanding our suffering, for accepting our suffering, for recasting our narratives of suffering, but as one that also needs to be shared verbally with other people. Because, I have a tendency, maybe a little bit like Dickinson, to, feel rejected sometimes by the marketplace, and then, write a lot about my trauma and then do nothing with it. And I find that I just continue to sit in my trauma when I do that. So I really do have to share. And because I'm in so many, sort of medically inspired and trauma informed spaces, that's allowed me to become a better sharer as well, because I have to model that, I have to model my vulnerability. So that's what I think my vision of inclusivity is, that we can all use poetry as a kind of portal for understanding ourselves and each other.
I was thinking along those lines too, just from a different angle. I was thinking about how something so I learn a lot from reading other writers who share my background, but also who don't share my background, right? And so I think, what you're saying, Rosemarie, absolutely, like the sharing has to be there, but I think also the audience has to be there to receive it too.
That's true. That's true.
And a lot of other artists that I've read or that I've worked with, sometimes express a nervousness that they don't know how their work is going to be received by the audience,
Right.
especially if it's much more kind of identity focused, right? If it's something about, a trans identity, or if it's something about an identity of color, right? Like they don't know if people in the audience are going to be there for it, or people are just going to walk out, And so like, I think that's something that might be a barrier to some people trying to get their work out there or perform too, and
I agree. I hear where you're coming from, because I find that's the case in our community. But again, when you bring people together in a space that is considered safe, where we're all kind of modeling the same sort of vulnerability, I'm thinking more of the space of the workshop as opposed to the formal reading, because I think the workshop is where the magic happens. That's where people are really willing to get vulnerable.
Mm-hmm.
And when you're writing the poetry of, your medical trauma, I don't think that's generally well received, by the Gen Pop either. And I think a lot of us won't take that next step and, share it with the Gen Pop. But, maybe if we create enough of these sort of, pockets of vulnerability within the community, eventually we can start kind of joining, those little pockets of vulnerability, those little spaces in which we've created these vulnerabilities or showcased them. I feel like that's happening. And maybe, we have to be satisfied with that, because I always think, well, how much can we change other than our little corner? You know what I mean?
Well, what I was thinking is, there's a quote, and I feel horrible for not remembering the person who said it, but it's something like, if you have come here to help me, you don't need to be here. But if you're here because your liberation is bound up in mine, then let us work together, right? And that's sort of what I'm trying to get at.
That's beautiful.
I learned so much from reading people whose backgrounds I don't share, and I would love to see that be a more widespread practice, I think. Not to like doubt that people aren't doing that, but I've also been in others like creative spaces where like there isn't sort of that consciousness maybe, or like people are kind of really citing like only poets of a certain background and completely ignoring poets of other backgrounds. So, I would love to see kind of a readership or an audience like go to an event just because maybe you don't know as much about that stories,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
And you want to learn more, you know, so maybe don't go to events that are just ones that speak to you, but go to events that are wildly different, because you know what, they could also speak to you and you wouldn't know if you
Yes.
didn't go. So
That's a great challenge to everyone, that, you know, people need to enter into LGBTQI spaces and medical spaces and spaces that may make you uncomfortable, because guess what? We're uncomfortable sharing that stuff with people who don't share that narrative with us. So, you know, I think there's something about, you know, poetry kind of bringing us together in discomfort too. Think about that. Think about how uncomfortable just poetry itself makes people in the general population. And in medical poetry, we have this phrase that I stole from Mark Doty, the poet, called sitting with uncertainty, that a poem teaches you how to sit with uncertainty. And I always cite Dickinson, because how many times do we read a Dickinson poem and think, what the hell was that about? And so I feel like opening a class with Dickinson is the best way to teach medical students how to sit with uncertainty. So I'm all about that. Yes, we have to be uncomfortable because life is uncomfortable. So, yes.
This is such a wonderful place to conclude our evening together. Thank you for bringing it back to Dickinson, Rosemarie. Thank you for that lovely quote, Resi, which someone in the chat is saying that maybe is from Lila Watson. And
I'm looking it up. I just went, what?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, Mark Doty is the person I stole it from, just so you know.
Yeah.
But that's, wow. Thank you so much.
I think that was in reference to the quote Resi was sharing.
Oh,
yeah.
okay.
I mean, this is just, you know, just thank you both of you for the vulnerability that you had and you shared with us this evening. Thank you for taking us on a journey through your own storytelling. It has been such a complete and utter pleasure to have you both as part of this series. Someone in the chat was asking, you know, how often we do this. If this is your first time, welcome. We're so glad you're here. We do these monthly. And in fact, we have another one coming up next month. And that is the final reading of our year. It is the culmination of our Phosphorescence Poetry Reading Series. So next month in December, we're bringing you Julia Lysella and Cami Thomas. I think Cami is here this evening. Hi, Cami. See you next month. Also in December, we are going to be bringing you 3 ways to celebrate Emily Dickinson's 191st birthday, including a behind the scenes look at the museum during our biggest ever restoration project at the homestead, and also a very special top secret announcement from our friends at Apple TV's hit show Dickinson. So we hope you'll tune in for all of that. If you haven't already joined our mailing list, you can find it here. I'm putting a link in the chat. That's also a great place to make a donation to support our continued free programming. Most importantly, these wonderful poets have work online. They also have books for sale. I'm going to put a link in the chat to the preferred bookseller of the Phosphorescence Poetry Series. But of course, you can visit their websites to learn more about how to keep track of them. Rosemarie and Resi, if you would like to, feel free to put your handles in the chat for anyone if you want to keep in touch with folks that way. Just thank you both so much. Resi Ibañez, Rosemarie Dombrowski, it's been a total joy. I hope that we will get to be together at the Emily Dickinson Museum in person sometime soon. Let's have a reunion tour.
Yes, please. Thank you so much for having us. Thank you. What an honor.
Thank you. And I meant to say this earlier, if I could do a last minute plug. So the piece about my mom and the kitchen and dishes, it's actually going to be coming out in a book soon. That book is, thank you, Brooke, for putting in the chat. It's being backed on Kickstarter. The project is fully funded. So if you go to Kickstarter and back it and choose your book, you will get a copy of it because it has been fully funded. And it's going to be on Kickstarter for just a few more days. But it's part of a wonderful anthology, all about pieces about super powerful Asian mamas. So I hope you check it out because there's some great pieces in there. Thank you for letting me do a last minute plug.
I'm glad we got that in there. Yeah, that's important. So I'm also just going to put websites in one more time in case you didn't get them before. And we do encourage you to go and learn more about these fantastic poets. Thank you again for being with us, everyone.
Thank you for having us. Thank you.
Week.
Thank you, friends, for coming. Thank you.